Hi, it's Robert Mendelson, Fractional CMO here in beautiful Montreal, welcoming you to another episode of the Fractional Pros Canada podcast. We're part of Fractional Pros Canada, the home for Canada's fractional community, and you can find us on Facebook. We bring you conversations about everything fractional that matters for fractional executives and businesses from coast to coast. Think of this as your go-to spot for real talk, practical wisdom, and strategies you can actually use, all without the corporate fluff and with plenty of Canadian content. Whether you're a fractional pro or a business in our great country of Canada and beyond, this conversation is for you. Grab your espresso and let's dive in. Welcome to the Fractional Pros Canada podcast. I'm your host and fractional CMO, Robert Mendelson, here in beautiful Montreal. For a while now, this podcast has been dedicated to showcasing the incredible talent and insights from fractional leaders right here across Canada. But one of the best things about the fractional movement is that it's a global community. So today we're launching a brand new special series that you'll see pop up from time to time. It's called the Cross-Border Playbook. And in it, we'll be connecting with our friends and colleagues from across the border to get their unique perspectives on business growth and the fractional economy. And to kick off our very first Cross-Border Playbook episode, I am thrilled to welcome Sean Foote. Sean is a fractional CRO and CMO, joining us today from beautiful Nashville, Tennessee. Yeah. And Sean has over 15 years of executive experience driving massive growth at companies like Google, Revance, and Wilton Brands by aligning marketing, sales, and operations into a single, powerful RevOps framework. Today's Fractional Pros Canada podcast is powered by Your CMO, the proven framework for fractional CMOs. I run my practice on the Your CMO system, and it has definitely upped my game, as it can for any fractional CMO. You can learn more at yourcmo.com. That's YORCMO.com. Sean, welcome to the pod and the first ever Cross-Border Playbook episode.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me, Robert. I'm looking forward to digging in with you today.
All right. So just a little context. So you and I have known each other for a while now. We met at the Your CMO training. It was probably almost a year ago now. And in those few days we spent together, we became fast friends. And I'm really thrilled to have you here. And we're going to dig into some things that are on topic and probably a little bit off topic as well, because we just know each other that well. But before we go there, okay, this is off script. This is not part of anything I planned, but I think this is really one of the most interesting things I know about you is your taste for music. Could you just share with everybody what your preferred genre of music is, please?
Metal. Yeah.
No. It's more specific than that.
There's there's different genres of metal, but I'd say it's probably heavier metal. I'm not sure if you're looking for something specific there, but like bands like Gojira, who played at the Olympics, that's kind of my flavor.
Okay, nice. I think that's really cool. I used to be a big metal fan back in the 90s. I was a big Iron Maiden guy. I'd go see Motley Crue concerts and all that. Yeah. I still have a soft spot for the metal bands. One of the things, we'll talk about it from a marketing perspective maybe. One of the interesting things about metal is that there are very few radio stations that would play them. Of course, now radio stations are pretty irrelevant anyways, but back in the day, it was rare to find a station that was playing any kind of quantity of metal, and yet metal maintained its popularity. It had like this cult following. People were buying the albums, going to the concerts, guys like you and me, and it survived. It was kind of like an off-the-radar success, which is interesting from a marketing perspective, and maybe we can dig into that another time, all about those kinds of successes where they don't use traditional channels but they still have success. All right, we got the metal thing out of the way. I love it. All right, now you worked in the corporate world, right? Your journey to going fractional was coming from corporate, and there's a lot of fractionals I know that we have listening who are either in corporate now thinking about making the leap into fractional, or they are now fractional, but they came from the corporate world and they're still trying to kind of navigate how to make it a success, figure out where they fit in, and deal with all the issues that come with fractional. Your isolation, you're not working in an office anymore. You don't have the same number of colleagues surrounding you, resources, etc. So share with us a little bit how you decided to make the switch, the leap, if you will, from corporate life to fractional life?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think one word I've been kind of working around and with lately is modular. And I think my journey specifically, I've been very fortunate where I've had the opportunity to work directly with boards and C-levels almost my entire career, even when I was a more junior professional, going from startups to mid-markets to the Googles of the world. And I think that range of experience really kind of informed this pathway. But the end of the day, learning how to speak with those top level, very business oriented leaders, such as board members and C levels, really conditioned me, I think, and created a dovetail into the fractional world. I also think, I'm no stranger. I was no stranger to remote work. If you're working for a global brand like Google, that's just part of their DNA. It has been. I would go into the office, a couple times a week at most, and then work remote because there was people all around the world you're working with. So I think I've been kind of uniquely conditioned to work towards a fractional pathway. And I think just anyone that is looking for that flexibility and has that similar pathway, I think it's a really natural fit.
Yeah, you definitely followed a bit of a path that was more obvious, I guess, to moving into the fractional side of things versus somebody who was working not so remotely, not so virtually, not for a tech company who was ahead of the curve on virtual work, and somebody who's used to doing the 9 to 5, 5 days a week, so to speak, and then moving all of a sudden. Here I am, I'm right here in my dining room / office, and there's no one else around here.
Yeah, I think as a fractional, you get that through your network, right? You're going to really have to build and bolster that network, whether it's referral partners or just colleagues from the past, that you got to really focus on building those relationships. And I think that's how you maintain some of that connectivity with people, when you're more remote. So it's definitely, if there's one piece of advice I can give to folks that are aspiring to be a fractional, is really nurture that network.
Yeah, 100% community makes all the difference. That's why I started Fractional Pros Canada, which we're now getting pretty close to about 1,000 members of fractionals of all kinds from right across Canada. And I know that one of the pieces of feedback I often get from members of the community that I speak with is just being a part of the community and just knowing it's there. The Facebook group is there if they need to reach out. There's people they can find who are simpatico with what they're doing or complimentary, and it makes a big difference. So totally agree.
I think community, like just kind of sidebarring on that for a little bit. I think that's so critical. I've done a lot of like research. I'm a self-development nerd. You know me pretty well, and I think community is actually a key indicator of longevity in life. You know what I mean? So it's even
Yes.
beyond the professional lens. Two things, mobility, mind, heart, body, spirit, keeping your mind fresh, keeping your body fresh, and community are two critical things. So I think there's lots of benefits to it beyond just being, fractional.
Yeah, I've read studies. You might correct me on this because you're more of the data nerd than I am, but there's something along the lines of like people who have like just as few as 2 or 3 really close friends, the type of friends who, they don't judge you. You can go to them anytime with anything. You may not talk to them for a year or two. And when you do reconnect, it's as if you pick up where you left off. People with that kind of community tend to live longer than those who don't. And I guess it goes back to like the caveman tribal stuff that we still have going on inside of us, which is just we're wired to be part of a tribe, so to speak. And if you are part of that tribe, if you found your tribe, then it's just going to make your life that much better and apparently that much longer.
100%.
Cool. All right. CRO, Chief Revenue Officer. There's still a lot of people out there who don't know exactly what that is. Some people say a CRO, oh, you mean a sales guy, right? Some people think that. Others see it as, well, it's kind of like a blend of sales and marketing. What's your take on it? How do you define what a CRO does?
Yeah, great question. I think it's really the leadership lens that sits typically in an ideal scenario above marketing, sales, and operations. right? So if you have someone that understands that framework and how the individual marketing teams work, how the individual sales teams work, and how operation needs to run, you have this really unique perspective on an organization, right? And typically where you find a lot of disconnect in organizations is where those are all different leads and they all have different goals. So a CRO in an ideal state will come into a situation and really lead those three functions and keep them all kind of on the same path.
So then the way you're explaining it, there could be already be a CMO and a head of sales, et cetera, and they would they report into the CRO, or they sit next to the CRO, but the CRO is kind of keeping them as some, what does that structure look like? What's the hierarchy there?
It totally dependent on the organization. I think like you mentioned, it really does depend what they're working with already or what they aspire to work with. One of the benefits of being a fractional, as you know, is you can kind of fit, and this goes back to that word modular, right? You can fit into any organization based on their needs and their specific growth stage, right? Or where they are. It's kind of like, instead of forcing yourself into an organization to move the needle a certain way, you're coming into the organization and almost like a chameleon and fitting in and supporting them as they need. So CRO, I've seen them sit where a CMO typically would. I've seen them sit where a sales leader typically would. I haven't seen them sit on operations lead as much. That's usually a COO. But either way, you need to have a really in-depth understanding of all three of those functions to some degree to be a successful CRO, in my experience.
All right, you mentioned the word modular, and I know you use the term building modular revenue engines, which I think is a great three words that mean a lot. Can you unpack for us what that actually means in practice? Modular revenue engines.
Sure, sure. So it boils down to how I think of my ethos around building, right? And that's a framework of 5 considerations. It's strategy, operations, technology, people, and measurement. And you noticed it's agnostic of marketing and sales. And that's purposeful because I think you need to have an enterprise first view to go into an organization and really support it holistically beyond just the growth function, beyond just the sales function. Right. So I think modular is plugging in to any one of those 5 components, again, based on the state of the organization and really moving the needle and moving it forward from that perspective.
One of the things I see a lot, probably all fractionals see a lot, when you start engaging with a new client, there's always misconceptions that the business owner, the CEO, whoever it is that we're, reporting to, so to speak, or working with or for, has. And especially with a fractional CRO, where they may not exactly know. So where I'm going with this is sometimes, the founder, the business owner, the CEO, they think they know what they need versus what they actually need, because they're just too inside the forest. They're inside the bottle, can't read the label. What's your take on that? What's the biggest misconception that a business owner has when they first engage with a fractional? Maybe it's a CRO or CMO, since you work in both capacities. What's your take on that?
Yeah, well, and this is why, I lean on analytics and data so much, because it is the one differentiator that I think, if it's presented properly and it's clean, it can really kind of reset expectations and really set the table for that conversation internally. Some organizations that aren't data driven, I truly wonder how they know where they're going, where they're at, or where they're going. So I think coming in, being data driven and being more objective, right? And setting a standard through an audit and through data driven analysis, as much as you have on hand, of course, and really looking to build growth smartly, because not all growth is smart. Right? Not all growth is smart. I've been parts of organizations that want to grow for growth's sake, but they're so focused on that growth number and however they measure it, that they're not, pausing to think about, do we have the people to support the growth? Do we have the systems and processes to support the growth? In other words, do they have the infrastructure to support the growth? Because one of the worst things you can do, and I think some organizations found this out the hard way during COVID, because it kind of flipped the market on its head a little bit, was especially like e-commerce organizations. I know you have some experience there, fulfillment. in that scenario was a huge challenge for a lot of organizations. They would burn through their inventory because of that push to e-commerce. So I think, again, it goes back to, I digress. It goes back to just really looking at data and then having a smart conversation around data to kind of reset expectations in an organization.
Yeah, and it's still amazing every time, I start talking with a new client, or I hear other fractionals relating the same stories, that when you ask the question, one of the basic questions, all right, tell me what's your scoreboard look like? What do you measure, right? So for marketing activities, tell me what are the main, KPIs you're measuring every day or every week? And very often the answer is simply scoreboard. um, well, we look at our sales every day, and that's kind of the end. And
Yeah.
so a lot of companies it's incredible that what seems basic to you and I guess, to many companies, they're not even measuring this. So they don't even have the data. We like to go into a company and we want to see the data. So the data tells a story. And very often the data is just not there. It's not being gathered. And there's a whole variety of reasons for it. Maybe it is being gathered, but not properly. The whole switch to Google Analytics 4, I think, is still a nightmare. I went through it with my e-commerce business. It's that was the biggest, least user-friendly move that I think Google has ever made to this day.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's surprising that we wanna work with data because that's indisputable. But if the data is not there, then we need to start somewhere else.
Yeah. I think there's also a matter of, is the data clean? When we talk about pipeline and forecasting, for example. And when we talk about what we're measuring, is it a volume metric or a percentage-based metric, right? Because there's a big difference between, as a marketer from a marketing lens, driving traffic and then looking at things like CPM, click-through rate, you know what I mean, return on ad spend, cost to acquire, right? So what I'm meaning to say here is, these, I call them vanity metrics. Anything that's a volume metric is helpful for trend, but it doesn't really get into the nitty gritty of efficiency, right? Efficiency is what we're all after when you're talking about smart growth beyond those other elements I talked about. So I think most organizations, it's not either they don't have the data or they're looking at the wrong data points or metrics to kind of, as a measuring stick for where they're going. And then, or they're looking at biased metrics that are just more on one part of the organization. Well, what about, churn rate? What about lifetime value? What about NPS scores, right? Like, without throwing out too many more acronyms here, I think it's about really having that cross-functional conversation, getting all those leaders. A successful growth leader will do everything they can to get all of those leaders into one room and have a conversation about, mindful conversation about, and productive conversation about, what are they all measuring, and then how does that cascade down to the larger organization, and does it support the enterprise goals, right? So I think that's critical. Organizations that I've always said they're akin, organizations that don't have goals are like akin to, it could be a beautiful ship. You could have a good product, right? You could have a good brand. It could be this beautiful ship in the ocean, but it doesn't have either a sail or a rudder, right? Typically, it could be a sail without a rudder, or it could be a ship that's just like, basically spinning, right? So I think those goals are critical, and that's one of the first things I'll ask coming into an organization is, do they have goals, and what are they? And really dig in there, and that's, as that's typically part of the audit process.
Yeah, and there's a whole probably other episode to do on the difference between metrics and KPIs,
Yeah,
between, what are you measuring? Are you measuring leading indicators or lagging indicators? And
yes,
depending on the case, some are right, some are wrong. There's a whole probably series of episodes to do on analytics and that fun
totally,
stuff. We'll
totally.
save that one for another time. Let's move to everybody's favorite topic today and talk about AI, right? So a lot of organizations are talking about AI and complex AI, and a lot of organizations are saying, "Oh, we're ahead of the game. We've got AI. We're starting to integrate it." And maybe they are, but they're trying to keep up with the pace of AI and they're moving really fast with it. And sometimes they're doing it without keeping the foundations and the basics in place first, right? So, for example, I think you mentioned to me in a previous conversation, a lot of companies, they still don't know how to set goals. And here they are, layering on new technology. They don't even know what their goals are. They don't even know where they're going. They're drowning in data and they're adding more data now and more enablement, but they still have missed out on the foundations and the basics. So what do if there's somebody's listening today and like, oh my God, that's me, that's my company, that's my business. What would you say to them? Where should they start? What should they do about that to get back down to the basics and create, data-driven growth strategies that have the foundation there before they start playing around with this AI stuff?
Yeah, well, that's why, originally in my ethos is around those foundational pillars, right? So do some housekeeping before you think about your strategy. m- Audit your operations. Do you have basic things like project management in place? Oh, how do the functions work together? Technology. Is your technology integrated? Do you have redundant technologies that are I've been in parts of organizations that'll have multiple CRMs in the same organization. Your people. Do you have people's in the seat the people in the seats to drive this stuff? I've seen organizations invest tens of thousands of dollars not have anyone to drive it. No one to really, once it's onboarded, to run with it. And that's just crazy to me. And then of course, we already talked about measurement, right? So I think you gotta, in an ideal state, I'm not saying this works for everyone, but you have those things in place and clean and tight, including the data cleanliness. And then you layer on AI for velocity, right? Right. AI, it's like going back to that ship analogy. Imagine it's a ship with a full sail, no rudder, but then now you have hurricane winds blowing it. That's what AI could represent. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? So I think one, that point, and two, big fat asterisks next to AI. And you and I are both into it, right? So I'm pro AI, but 40% of AI data, I've seen multiple studies, Chat GPT is sourced from Reddit. Let's let that sink in, right? That's crowdsourced data. And often a lot of AI, and I know they're getting better at this, I feel, but AI engines hallucinate. And what that means is if they don't have an answer, they'll make one up. So you have to leverage AI, but get someone, one, in the seat that knows how to drive it and knows these things, right? And then make sure it's integrated smartly into your organization. But I think there's multiple layers of infrastructure that you should put in place as checks and balances before you really turn loose AI in your organization. Once you do that, it can be wonderful. You can have amazing velocity. It can make things move faster. It can, cut out human error. It can, especially on the data side. AI has been part of data for a while, but I think just make sure you do it. Again, not all growth is smart growth. And I think this is just an extension of that. Layer on AI at the right time.
Yeah, and even before AI came on the scene, right? It was the same story. Oh, we're implementing Salesforce. Yeah, it's gonna make us so much better. Um, you know, oh yeah, we just got HubSpot. We're in the process of integrating HubSpot. It's gonna make us awesome, but there's no plan for it. The focus is on get this software in place, going to solve all our problems, but the thought hasn't gone into okay, now you've got the software, right? It's day two, software is in place, ready to go. Have you thought about campaigns? Have you been gathering customer emails, contact
Yeah, yeah,
info? You have a house list, and they become
and
an afterthought. And
totally.
it's path of least resistance, right? Is to invest in these new technologies. Now it's AI. Oh, we need AI. That'll help us. But
Yeah,
there's so much more to that, right? Fundamentals first. Fundamentals first.
100%. I mean, HubSpot is nothing new. I'm an early HubSpot adopter. I've been involved with that since I think the mid to late, like 2009, I think. So really old HubSpot guy. And even now to this point, um, organizations aren't implementing it correctly or to its full potential. So now we're talking about layering AI on, right? Again, cart before the horse. So I think get your house in order, run an audit with a smart fractional or internal leader, and then start to phase in a roadmap This is a conversation about like road mapping, right? Start to phase in a roadmap for your organization that makes sense. Don't check the box just to check it. It's really dangerous.
So sequencing is key
Yeah.
and a major challenge, right? In what order do you do things? Use the technical term. And so let's put your CRO hat back on. Talk about pipeline governance, lifecycle frameworks that help a company decide what to do first. Give us an example, maybe, of a common sequencing mistake that you often have to fix when you start working with clients.
Yeah, I think I've touched on some of it already, right? I think a very common one, and you even touched on it, having so much data they don't know what to do with. Well, when we talk about governance, one of the first things, and I've worked with a lot of data and IT teams here, so this is like from that perspective, even of expertise, you got to have clean data, and it needs to be, without getting too technical, it also needs to be mapped properly, right? So before you put it into something like a CRM and you have multiple documents, are they all mapped the same way? So I think if you really want to leverage things like marketing automation, CRMs effectively, automating your business for scale, right? In any way, if your data isn't the first checkpoint, you're setting yourself up for failure. So I think that data cleanliness is so critical to governance. And then separately from that, things with GDPR and a lot of these privacy regulations. And I know there's a lot, from what I've read and understand, there's a lot more in Canada. There's a lot of consent is a bigger thing even there. So, for your audience, it's like, man, even more so privacy, double opt in. These things that you would think would be basic, common sense application, get skipped. Or so I think really cleanliness and that strong foundation is really critical. And then you can do the other things, like I mentioned, you can layer on the tech, you can layer on ops, you can hire people that can really move the needle, and because your operations are ready to receive them, right? And then of course, without clean data, you can't measure. I mean, you can, but God, talk about dangerous for your organization if you're running it off of data that isn't accurate and you're making all these decisions off it. Your leadership is effectively it's even worse than flying blind, right? They're flying in the wrong direction potentially. So I think that data, I would say that if I had to really, like boil the ocean on that one, it's get your data clean, get it into one place, make sure it's been looked at and cleaned, and then you can start to layer on all the other aspects.
Yeah, it's almost like no data is better than bad data, because at least
Yeah,
if you have no
100%.
data, then at least you know you don't have any data. By the way, is it data or data?
Oh man, I think that depends on where you're from.
I've
You
always
know,
said data, but I don't know. I've heard people say data. I don't know where they're from, but I
uh,
don't know. You say data.
potato, potato, tomato, tomato. You know how
Oh,
it goes.
that's a whole other bowl of vegetables.
This is, especially when you're bridging Canada to the U.S., right?
That's right. We add extra letters here and there. Um, so digital detective work is one of the terms you use as part of your process. You're kind of talking about that. So what are the first few questions you ask other than data? Is there anything else that you focus on or that you see a lot of companies they're deficient in, they're making a mistake in, or maybe it's a blind spot that you see happening repetitively?
Yeah, I think again, you can see multiple investments across functions and tech that really is redundant, and you're double investing. So talk about killing your EBITDA or killing your profit margin. If you have leaders in all these different organizations investing in redundant, or in some cases, technology that can't integrate, can't talk. These platforms can't talk to each other. They're passing data vertically instead of horizontally, right? I think that's really a challenge. So when you say being a digital detective, I think digging into again operations, technology, people, and measurement, and there are lots of different considerations in each of those. But I think ops is another one, right? So how are these organizations executing? Like when you're talking about a really complex organization like Wilton or Google that have people, large groups of people all around the country and potentially the world, how are they talking to one another? How are they communicating? Two big things for me so far is my like mission, accountability and transparency. Like with those two things, you can have some semblance of integrity. Without those two things, it's really hard. It might not even be intentional. So I think technology is another thing, right? Like how are you passing information? And then of course, operations, how are people communicating and how are we executing? in market.
So let's talk about one aspect of, the source of the problems, in quotes, that companies have. I'm talking about the people, right? What if the people are the problem? So you come into a company as a CRO, for example, and you've done your digital detective work and you figured out, all right, they've got data, it's clean data, they're using data right, they're measuring, they got the right metrics, but somehow the company's still not getting ahead. And you ultimately deduce, as you start to meet the team and interact with other players, you start to understand that there's people issues. And often our roles of fractionals start to bleed over because we all come across that at some point. We come in for a special expertise, right? CMO for marketing, CRO, RevOps, and we check off all the boxes, but we're trying to find out, like, where is this company not performing, and it ends up being none of that technical stuff. It's good old people problems. So when you come into a situation like that, how do you typically treat it? Do you kind of take it on yourself, or do you, because you get really touchy, right? If you go to, let's say, the head of HR, and say, hey, I've been here for a few months now and I've noticed this and that. Well, that could come across badly to the head of HR, because you're indirectly kind of saying that there's issues they don't know about, or maybe they do know about them, but they're not doing anything about them. So how do you negotiate that?
Yeah, so I think people centrism is a huge thing for me. I think an organization is only as good as their consumers or customers and their people. If you aren't taking care of those two things, and your competition is, they will beat you. They will. I can say that confidently. So I think how you manage that, I think part of that is dependent on in all transparency, on the politics of the organization. You know what I mean? And I think going in there first 30, or what, depending on the scope and what you're doing, of course, right? So first 30 is just get one-on-ones with as many people as you can. Get to know all of the cross-functional leaders, especially as a CRO, right? Get to know them all, one human to another first, one human to another. I think that's really critical. I think because without that trust building, you don't really have a relationship. And that's where people centrism comes in. And then I think separately, and this is what I've done in almost every role in my leadership roles, and then I'll get anyone that reports into me or even skip level one-on-ones with every single person. It's worth the time investment. It really is. And then you start to get to know people. Let's say someone comes in and is dropping the ball. Well, if you know them as a human being, you might know that they have some rough things going on personally, right? And it gives you a little bit more empathy and understanding. And I think without those two things, you can't be compassionate. You can't be a genuine, high EIQ people leader. So I think the first thing is to get that, talk about gathering data, right? It's more like qualitative, but gathering data and having conversations with people is really critical. And then I think giving it time, being patient too, because some people will come in and make a knee-jerk reaction without any context, and you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot. So I think those two things are really critical to people problems. And then from there, you once you get to know them as a person, you start to talk about the function, right? And then the functions are more like, again, what are your goals? Where are you going? What are you doing? Kind of where have they been? Where are they at? And where would they like to go? Type conversation, right? And then you get all of this information. You get, the leaders, you get, your team, maybe even some key members from other teams, and you put it all together. Then you can make an informed decision and discussion. Then you have an informed discussion. And then you can say, like, what really should I do here with this information, right? Some cases it might need to be a conversation with HR. But I'm never the type of guy that will, one, call someone out publicly in front of their team or in front of the organization, or two, skip all those levels and just jump right to, that kind of situation. But if there is an issue most organizations have a process for documentation and then something like a performance improvement plan, typically. But if you're having regular conversations with your team and with key functional leaders, 95% of the time, it won't be necessary. It won't, because you'll get to the root of the issue before you get to that drastic component. But there are times for it. I've had to do that too, and it's never fun. But if you build that relationship, I feel like people will trust you. If you have the trust, you can effectively lead.
Yeah, I totally agree with them one-on-ones as the strategy, especially when you have a client that you never meet, right? You're working virtually. They can be anywhere, you're anywhere. But just having that 30-minute, once a week, once every 2 weeks. And I find that the key is also not just have the one-on-one, but the first 5-10 minutes of it, we don't talk about business. I want to know, like, what's going on in your life. What's, start
Totally.
with like, what was a win in your personal or family life in the last week or two since we last met? Right. I mean, I'm a big foodie. Anytime somebody says, "Oh, I had a birthday party," I'm gonna ask, like, "Well, what did you have to eat? Like, did your mom make something?" Or I'm just gonna go down that food rabbit hole really fast,
Sure. Sure.
and that often connects us because, let's face it, everybody eats. Now, some people don't really care as much about what they eat, but that's always been a good starter for me. I used to have, when I used to work in the corporate world, I had a VP of sales boss, and he would always preach that whenever we would go into a territory, and most of our sales, we were selling into the US. We were based here in Montreal, but we're selling into the US. And back then we do a lot of trade shows and stuff and do a lot of cold calls. And he would always say, before you speak to that person, figure out, what city they live in, what state they're in, what's going on in the sports world, right? If it's football season, make sure you're up on like the NFL stuff going on there, something like that, and always have like that one point of connection that you can like start the conversation off with a total stranger. And instead of talking business, all of a sudden you're talking football, and well, the magic starts to happen from there.
Totally. I mean, and that's why I think the common thread we're pulling on here is connection. We even talked about community early in the conversation, and that's really the ethos behind my brand. That's what Continuo means. You know what I mean? And I think that's how critical it is. I feel like not just connection of systems and all the things we were talking about earlier, but without the connection to people, what are we doing this for? You know what I mean? Like for real. So I think that's so critical. It's why I've been, a successful leader in my career. And also, whether it's managing people or managing, meaning like employees or managing clients, to me, it's much the same. I think you got to build that relationship. You got to build the trust. And then from there, you have like a strong foundation to layer the other elements on.
Yeah, I guess that brings us to, like, at the end of the day, the data is important, but the people are more important. If you don't have the people figured out, if you don't have the connection between all the team members working together well and, figuring out their differences, because there always are some, you can have the greatest data in the world, but you're going to have those people issues that are going to put that monkey wrench into the wheel.
Yep. Consumer centrism, people centrism. How I think every leader should be constantly auditing themselves around those two things.
How do you audit yourself? What's a process for auditing yourself? That's sometimes harder than
Man,
auditing somebody else.
do you got another hour? I think
Well,
I think a huge part for me is I journal every day without question, and I start my journals with gratitude. What am I grateful for? And it doesn't, there's no rules to that. It's just whatever you're compelled to write. Right. And I do at least a page every day. And then I talk about all the other elements professionally, personally going on. Right. So it's almost a form of self therapy to some degree, but it's also, I think, a good way to check in and say, like, hey, let's talk about accountability and transparency. Well, I might have messed up a little bit here. Maybe I stubbed my toe. Maybe I said something that wasn't intended to be, was a little bit harsh. So then you can go back, right? Without that lens, that regular recurring lens, it becomes, I think you can kind of get lost pretty easily. You can get lost in things that maybe at the end of the day aren't quite as important. If you're super successful in business, but you're stepping on people the entire way there, and making, your teams and your coworkers and your clients, whatever the lens is, if you're taking and not giving, I feel like that's an unsuccessful life. So that's, I think, if there's one piece of advice I could give, start a journal, man. Just start like one page a day, one paragraph a day, whatever it is, and start to ask questions. Ask a lot of questions about, yourself and others. And I think with that introspection, it just helps. It helps in all the ways.
yeah, and that gratitude exercise is something that I use, and I don't do it enough, but it's incredible how, if I can be self-aware enough, and I've kind of been working on it for years, to the point where I'm pretty self-aware, and if I notice myself in this, doomsday loop, downward spiral, I'm like, hang on a second, and I like Okay, I'm going to do 15 seconds of gratitude. Name 5 things I'm grateful for right now, right? Like if I were doing it right now, I'm like, the camera that I'm using right now, I'm grateful for it because it makes my life easy. I love having this microphone. I love the fact that, speaking with Sean, good friend, and all of a sudden it just breaks that cycle without even realizing it. And it's incredible. Just feel better after that quick break. It just resets. It breaks the bad patterns. It's incredibly ridiculously powerful and easy.
Yeah. Or take a step. Sometimes I'll just literally like push away, and I'll take 3 deep breaths. And part of it is biological, and part of it is, I would say, just creates space and a pause, right? So I think, how can you create space and pauses in your life to be a better leader and a better fractional?
Yeah, I've been known to say just out of nowhere, I don't breathe deeply often enough. And I get funny looks like, what? But it's true. When I take a deep breath, I feel so much better. And typically we're not breathing deeply. We're just breathing normally. If we're stressed, we're breathing shallow. It makes a big difference. Silly little life tips, which is a great way to end this podcast on. Let me ask you the one final question that has become a tradition here on the Fractional Pros Canada podcast, which is the billboard question. So what message would you put on a billboard for millions of business owners to see as they drive by it every day on the highway of life?
Oh, that's a good one. I'd say, I think it ties back into what I mentioned about, treat your people well, treat your customers well. You'll have sustainable, scalable growth.
We'll get an extra big billboard for you.
Well, I mean, maybe without being corny, do unto others. You know what I mean? Like, it really is that simple. Like, what you put out, you get. And, I'm never one to advocate for, building a business, unethically or nefariously or stepping on people on the way. Right. So I think really just honing that in and take care of your people, like you take care of your family, and you're setting yourself up for a successful life.
All right. So do unto others, perhaps with a ...
Yeah, that works. Maybe a really cool image that invokes curiosity.
Nice. All right, Sean, how can people connect with you?
Yeah, so you can check me out at my website, continuoconsulting.com. You can also look me up on LinkedIn, Sean Foote, last name Foote. If it's not on the screen here, I would love to connect with more folks, especially other fractionals, and continue to build that community we discussed.
Awesome. All right. Well, hey, man, thank you for being the first guest and not the last on the cross-border playbook series of the Fractional Pros Canada podcast. It's been a pleasure, and I'm sure that we will be speaking with you again soon.
Absolutely, Robert. Thank you so much, buddy. I appreciate it.
All right. Cheers. That's a wrap on another episode of the Fractional Pros Canada podcast. If you're a fractional professional based in Canada, we'd love to have you join us in the Fractional Pros Canada Facebook group, the home for Canada's fractional community. It's where Canadian fractional executives connect, share insights, and help each other succeed. Until next time, I'm Robert Mendelson, Fractional CMO. May your impact be full-time, even if your hours are fractional.